So thank you for joining us, and I will turn the conversation over to Dr. Herring. So thank you much.
All right, thank you very much, Brian, and appreciation to the folks at NeuronUP for including this particular webinar in their series. One aspect of this webinar is it's less about the people we treat and help and more about ourselves and how we take care of ourselves so that we can actually be more effective therapists. Brian's already mentioned my affiliation, so I'll skip through some of these slides pretty quickly. A couple things we're trying to achieve this afternoon or evening is looking at how do we apply mindfulness to ourselves as practitioners in the field of neurorehabilitation, emphasizing how we grow as therapists, ultimately providing you with a very simple model that can help us increase our awareness and maybe lay the foundation for your own particular personal growth. So our outline will be spending some time about the why of awareness, the what of mindfulness, and ultimately exploring a very simple model that we use and we've adopted from the Conscious Leadership Group. And again, I have great thanks for the Conscious Leadership Group sharing their materials fairly liberally. I start with this slide. It's a little dated by the use of the terminology head injury. More up to date, it would be brain injury. This slide from Brian McMahon back in the late 80s, where it says brain injury rehabilitation is an extremely stressful endeavor. It's not for everyone. One of the things to think about is in our interactions with persons with brain injury, we, by the very definition of working in neuro rehab, are going to encounter behaviors that are at some level out of the ordinary, labeled as abnormal. And as a result, our brains are going to take two actions. The first is they're going to classify the behaviors that we're encountering in the patients that we work with as abnormal. And as a result, we will then have biases toward those behaviors that we probably aren't aware of. And secondly, we are going to react emotionally to those behaviors through some level of stress manifestation, whether we're aware of it or not. And so that issue and topic of awareness is going to be surfacing throughout today, because very quickly our brains go to story, regardless of the facts that are in front of us. And the fact might be a patient that said something inappropriate, patient who might not expressed appreciation for all the hard work you're doing as a therapist. Our brains are going to go to story very quickly. And that story is an elaboration that we bring to the table. And as a result of that story, we're going to react at some level that might be exasperation with the patient we're working with. It might be anger, it might be fear, it might be sadness. And just recognizing that that's going on is a key part of us managing the stress that we are under as therapists. As Brene Brown likes to say, if you don't recognize that the story is there and that you are the storyteller, it will control you. If you recognize the story that you are making up in your interactions with patients, people you serve, and actually with one another on an interdisciplinary team, you can begin to own the story and have an input on the outcome of that story. So most folks go into the field of neurorehabilitation because they get great joy from working with people who have encountered incredible life challenges through stroke, brain injury, other types of debilitating conditions, and they have a great degree of empathy for the people that they're working with. So that's sort of you show up in the field of neuro rehab with a positive orientation toward what you hope to achieve. And quite honestly, you get a lot of affirmation as a person working in the field that makes you appropriately proud of what you do. But then reality begins to set in. That reality includes elements of patients who might not make as much progress as you had anticipated. This is supposed to be an animated slide, so I'm having to think through it as we're going through. You're going to deal, at least in the United States, you're going to deal with insurance hassles. You're going to deal with administrative challenges. You're going to find yourself in the field of neuro rehab being stretched with regard to your professional roles. You might think you're an occupational therapist or just a physical therapist, and you're going to find yourself being also a behavioral therapist. You're going to find yourself being a counselor in the context of interacting with the patient. You're going to deal with behavioral presentations that you might not have anticipated. And you're also going to be working with coworkers who are going through many of the same challenges. And as a result, that's going to contribute to some of the stress that you recognize or feel in your day-to-day interaction. So just recognizing that we go from this to this fairly quickly. And part of the conscious therapist model and bringing mindfulness to the table is to try to recognize when this is happening so that we can be more strategic. So recognizing that our first reaction or normal response to the stressors we under is not necessarily always adaptive. And we have to recognize how to be more explicit and mindful on how we are responding, and not only how we're responding externally, but looking at what are our own internal thoughts and emotions, bodily sensations that are going on that might inform how we're doing. So one of the things that we try to do with our patients frequently is helping them develop awareness of their strengths and weakness following traumatic brain injury or stroke. And we also work toward them developing better self-awareness. It's sort of ironic that that same lens needs to be turned 180 degrees back on ourselves so that we are also growing self-awareness as we work with our patients. So this next slide, the curate ipsum is the idea of taking care of yourself, and take ipsum is the idea of being aware of yourself. This little tool here that I have on the slide was published several years ago by Mike Martelli and his team in 1994. It's called the Therapist Neurobehavioral Competence Rating Scale. It sort of foreshadowed some of our work here on the conscious therapist. And essentially what it says is to be a good therapist in the field of neuro rehab, you have to be able to look at your own skill sets. And a lot of those skill sets are not the technical skill sets. They're your own emotional and behavioral control. Do you have the ability to underreact when a circumstance requires that? Do you recognize that every challenge that you face is an opportunity for new learning, for you refining your skills as a therapist? So when you have that session that went really, really bad, based off of your interaction with the client, do you step back and go, wow, that was a wonderful time for me to learn more about neurorehabilitation, my patients, and myself, and am I willing to lean in and learn? So these are several of the elements of the Therapist Neurobehavioral Competence Rating Scale that if you're interested in some more growth, it's something that you can Google, and there's actually a slide at the end that has reference to Dr. Martelli's website. So we've talked about, in general terms, the conscious therapist. So your role is to improve the lives of persons with brain injury, acquired brain injury, hopefully through transdisciplinary therapy and using good theory in everything that you do. So the therapist side of that coin is you're hopefully using current best evidence. I think that some of the NeuronUP tools fall in that category of best evidence. But you're also bringing your own clinical expertise to the table, and you're also making sure that you're doing it in consultation with the patient. It's not top down. It involves motivational interviewing, shared decision making. The conscious side of the equation is, while you're being the therapist, taking full responsibility for how you are showing up in that dance between yourself and the patient. Are you committed to that self-awareness and learning to grow in everything that you do? So mindfulness and self-awareness has a number of different elements to it. And a lot of times when we first toss out the construct of mindfulness, images like this come to mind. So most of us do not work in a place where we can look out the window and see the Alps or the Smokies or the Rockies. We work in places that look like hospitals and look like community-based clinics. So the idea of mindfulness, sometimes you go, how can I include that in my setting? And mindfulness, if we step back and say, it actually is more about what we are attending to, what are we allowing to be the point of our focus, and what are we allowing ourselves to focus on, and making sure that we are doing that in a way with intention as we move through our day and our world. It has a lot to do with constructs of emotional intelligence that have been well published through the works of Dr. Daniel Goleman. And one of the core elements of emotional intelligence is that ability to know yourself and also to manage yourself through open awareness, the ability to have a dialogue with oneself and with one's coworkers about how you are showing up, and is at a team level, how we are showing up in the world. So that understanding mindfulness starts with examining our attention. What are we intending to pay attention to? That's the top-down element. And then what is grabbing our attention from the sort of the bottom up, and being aware of that. So you might have the intention of treating a patient's memory or their attention or their gait in a session, but what is grabbing your attention during the session is perhaps the patient's tone of voice that lets you know that they are displeased with something, and then you find yourself being anxious about what's going on. Mindfulness kicks in by you being able to be aware of that top-down intention and that bottom-up, and then deciding what you're going to do with that. Noticing what's going on within your own sensorium, your own emotional state, recognizing when your mind is wandering, and then being able to do that without judging yourself as you're going through. Rock and Page have published a lot on the role of emotions as great informers. There's a tendency sometimes in certain settings to say, we're only about the physical, we're not about the emotions. And our emotions are great summarizers, to quote Rock and Page, great summarizers of what all's going on in our entire nervous system. What are we learning about ourselves and the patient based off of what's going on inside of ourselves? So we think about being able to read emotions. We can sort of think of emotions coming through three centers of intelligence. What's going on inside of our head? What are we thinking of? Are you aware that you are maybe nervous in a particular situation? What's going on in our heart? Are you recognizing anxiety, fear, or anger? And then what is your gut telling you? Are you beginning to recognize, heat behind your ears because you're beginning to get a little tense? As a speaker right now, am I recognizing what my body is telling me about how I am showing up in the world, and how is that working for me?